Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our second training course brought to you by 3-Pillar Global, Agile for the Distributed Team, part of our series, Upskill While You Work From Home. We hope you and your families are staying healthy and safe. My name is Rafa Halawi, and I'm the campaign manager at 3-Pillar Global. I wanted to go over through some housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted throughout the webinar, but we would love to hear from you. Please type your answers in the questions box on your control panel, and we will be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. If we do not get to your question, you will receive an email with the answer in the next day or two. The webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording in the next day or two as well. The slides are available for download through the Handout tab on your control panel. Please feel free to download them at any time. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Kunal Shah, Manager of Product Strategy and Design at 3-Pillar Global. Kunal, over to you.
Thanks, Rafa. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our Agile for Distributed Team webinar. My name is Kunal Shah, and I'm a product manager here at 3-Pillar Global. As you know, distributed teams are a reality, and we at 3-Pillar, we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two about working in distributed team environments. And just like with any other distributed team that I work with, I usually get started with an icebreaker. So maybe we could take a quick poll here. And Rafa, if you can pull up the poll, just to kind of get a sense of how everyone's feeling. And once we get out of the current situation that we're in, what would be the first place that you would like to visit, the beach or the mountains?
I think we've collected our responses.
And the results are just in time for the summer. I typically prefer the mountains, but being isolated for so long, I think I'm ready for the beach. Thanks, Rafa.
Yep.
So just a couple of housekeeping items. As I get started here, I'm going to turn my video off so I can conserve a little bit of bandwidth and just avoid any hiccups with communication channel here. And I'll be back on camera once I go through the training and the presentation. So as we know, distributed teams are a reality. And working in a distributed team environment, we at 3-Pillar have been working in distributed team environment for quite some time. But right now, there's a lot of interest in distributed teams out of necessity. Unfortunately, distributed teams may become a way of working that people need to deal with more quickly. And I'm going to turn my video off. As the world is taking action to prevent the spread of coronavirus amongst its population, companies are acting quickly to do their part in preventing additional confirmed cases. Just like our offices, and I'm sure your offices as well, this is what it typically looks like. So for many, this means a speedy transition to fully distributed teams, which potentially contradicts the Agile Manifesto and introduces a series of new challenges in managing Agile teams. Agile can work in a distributed environment, but it's a lot of work, more work than you expect if you've never done it before. How do you manage Agile team that find themselves suddenly distributed? In this webinar, we'll explore this question, so let's jump right in. Before we talk about that, I just wanted to do a quick primer on Agile. So what is Agile? The actual definition of Agile is found in the Agile Manifesto. The manifesto makes it clear that Agile isn't a methodology. It isn't a specific way of doing software development. It isn't a framework or a process. Essentially, Agile is a set of values and principles. In fact, there are basically 4 values and 12 principles, rather than some sort of predefined blueprint. So for example, while a team may find that having a daily stand-up is helpful, the stand-up is only Agile to the extent that it is the result of a team following the values and principles prescribed by Agile. So when you understand this, it's easy to see that Agile is really a collection of beliefs that teams can use for making decisions about how to do the work of developing software. This means that if you truly understand what Agile is, it is surprisingly flexible. Agile doesn't make decisions for you. Instead, it gives you a foundation for teams to make decisions that result in better software development. In fact, when you actually, I don't know how many of you have actually read the Agile Manifesto, but it's essentially, when you read it, it's essentially 68 words. And very simply, it states that we can develop software better by valuing the items on the left more than the items on the right. Specifically, this means individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. In addition to the values of the manifesto, there are 12 principles that support the values. Once again, the principles are very general and are less about telling you what to do than they are about giving you the ability to make a good decision in a particular situation. So since Agile is a collection of values and principles, its real utility is in giving people a common foundation for making decisions about the best way to develop software. And since Agile is a set of values and principles, it's essentially an umbrella of several iterative and incremental software development approaches that have been around for quite some time. The approaches under this umbrella are the frameworks that are used to implement Agile development. Some are very lightweight, such as Scrum, that most you may know about, or Kanban, and while others are much fuller approaches, such as SAFe and LESS, which a lot of large-scale enterprises would end up utilizing. So how do we do Agile with distributed teams? As you saw earlier, the first value of Agile is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. This is extremely important because Agile is really for co-located teams. However, it's extremely flexible that it could be applied to distributed teams. So in distributed teams, these interactions are actually enabled. Sorry, skip back there. So in distributed teams, these interactions are enabled by tools such as the tool we're using for this webinar. There are many tools out there, from free to paid, that allow for fluid interaction, and we'll talk a little bit more about the tools later on in this presentation. We also need to take into consideration 3 key principles within the Agile Manifesto when working with distributed teams, specifically collaboration, which really talks about the business people and developers that must work together daily throughout the project. Build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done, essentially the tools that they're going to require. And finally, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversations. And we'll talk a little bit more about effective communication from a distributed team perspective, given the current situation that everyone on this who's attending this webinar is in. And finally, teams need structure, because when you're working from home, you need some sort of structure, right? I mean, you know, when do you start working? When do you stop working? What do you have to get done? What are you supposed to do? And so on. Do you work 8 hours? Do you work 10 hours? Do you work 1 hour and take 1 hour break? This really does require some sort of a structure. And for this, we need a framework. So before we move forward, let's take a moment to discuss some challenges distributed teams will have and how to overcome them. Since the first time you engaged in any team activity, whether in your childhood, in your teen years, in your adulthood, especially, when you in your childhood, getting on a team, working, playing whatever sport you may end up playing with other kids. You probably learned a very hard truth and an important lesson. Teamwork can be extremely difficult, right? Some people always want to, their egos end up taking control of everyone else around them. Um, because of this, Pat Linconi, and sorry, probably murdered his last name, um, talks about the 5 dysfunctions of a team in his book. These 5 functions can easily translate to distributed teams. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have trust. Transparency and honesty from the basis of trust. Beginning this process can be simple as discussing the fact that miscommunication, different agenda, and internal problems will happen and must be carefully managed. Without a strong trust as a base, conflicts arise because teams find it more challenging to debate constructively about ideas or bring up alternate solutions. Distributed teams must ensure that each member has the same opportunity to explore their ideas and concerns. So what does this mean from a distributed team perspective? That everyone's on a call. If, for example, in this webinar, if audio was on for all team members, I would encourage a healthy conversation and have all participants provide some sort of feedback or provide some sort of ideas so that we have a way to move forward from conflict. Next, teams that are unable to address all constructive ideas also have issues with members agreeing with and committing to ideas discussed. Distributed teams should address each person's concerns at the same time and avoid spreading information or decisions individually. So as you're working with other members, other colleagues, other members of your team, wherever they may be, I would really encourage that you have a team level conversation rather than, having one-on-one conversation and not spreading that information to the rest of the team. So if a team lacks trust, healthy conflict, and commitment, that team is less able to hold members accountable for each part. So distributed teams should check in regularly after clearly setting each person's responsibility. And finally, to drive ROI, distributed teams must focus on results just like in-person teams do. Distributed teams can find direction and drive results once they have clearly outlined goals and roles. So in essence, be open about weaknesses and mistakes to facilitate trust. Everybody needs to be committed to decisions. Hold a common goal instead of looking for individual results. So we know what the challenges are and how to overcome them. But what's the secret to making distributed teams successful? From our experience, and especially working with a lot of distributed teams here at 3-Pillar Global, we have members in the US spread across East Coast between New York, Virginia, DC. We have team members spread across Romania, Timișoara, Cluj, and Lassi. We have team members in India. And one of the secrets that we found to successful distributed team is to make the entire team feel that they're co-located. Essentially, make them feel that virtually we're all together, we're all in it as one team. So how do we do that? So there's a couple ways, and I'm going to talk about 2 important ways of doing that. One is, as we saw from Agile Manifesto, that we need structure, and the other is communications. I'll talk about communication a little bit later, but first I wanted to talk about structure. As I said earlier, Agile is a mindset and it's implemented by a framework. The most common framework to implement Agile is Scrum. So we'll use Scrum framework, and I'll go through the Scrum events, and we'll talk about how these Scrum events not only provide structure, but how they can work from a distributed team perspective. So the first event is the sprint. The sprint provides the heartbeat of Scrum. It defines time. It defines progress. It's the rhythm, which allows distributed teams to feel connected. This can be viewed as a container for all Scrum's inspect and adapt loops. Next event we have is sprint planning. The sprint planning starts with making sure that you have a clear set goal and you have a well-defined backlog. When you have these two items, you're able to provide focus over the length of the sprint that we talked about. So from that perspective, what does all the things add up to? What are we doing? What are we doing? How do we get there? What is the team going to focus on? What are the priorities? What will they build over the next 2 weeks, over the time of the sprint? In order to make sprint planning successful, make sure your product backlog items meet the definition of ready. Make sure they are ready to execute. This is extremely important in distributed environment. The backlog has to be clear. Everyone has to know what's in the backlog. It's got to be easily accessible. The stories that are defined in the backlog have to have clear acceptance criteria. The team should also identify and make sure that a very specific and clear goal is defined. When you're co-located, this is very easy to do because you can, walk up to your team member, you can have these conversations, you could talk about goals. But when you're distributed, when everyone is remote, this becomes extremely difficult. So how do you accomplish that? You accomplish that by making sure that you have defined everything clearly before you actually get into your sprint planning. And during the sprint planning meeting, you're sitting there and having these conversations so that the team clearly understands what is it that they're going to be doing over the next 2-week period so that they can figure out how they're going to actually accomplish that. The next event is the daily stand-up. This, and I cannot stress this enough, is extremely important for distributed teams. We at 3Pillar, especially working on a lot of our product development efforts with a lot of our distributed teams, this is extremely important for us, and we make sure that we do not skip this meeting because this gives a daily touch point. It allows all the team members to get together, and it allows them to not only provide progress, but it allows the team members to talk about their sprint goals. It allows the team members to make sure that they get value out of it. In distributed team, this is important to in distributed teams, this is important to have this because it allows the team to be connected to one another. And in daily stand-up, make sure that the team members are talking to one another. And I'm going to pause here for a second. Looks like I have some questions from the audience. And as I go through this, I encourage you to ask any questions you may have, and I'll do my best to pause and answer those questions. One of the questions I have from an attendee here is, how do you make sure everyone speaks up? It's harder on remote meetings to get people to talk. I can't imagine planning a sprint is easy. So how do you make sure everyone speaks up? So there's a lot of different mechanisms you can use. The Scrum Master is an extremely important person during your sprint planning process, or even in your daily stand-up, as well as in your sprint. That person has to be empowered enough to make sure that they are including everyone within the team and that they create a safe environment for all team members to add value and have discussions. And if you notice that certain team members are not speaking, as I do in many of my teams that I work with, sometimes, some team members, especially from a distributed team perspective, might be shy. I would, if it's a front-end developer, for argument's sake, I would lead a question towards that person, especially around a story that we may be discussing during our planning process, to see what type of potential problems that front-end developer might have, or if it's a QA person, try to pose questions for that QA person so that they feel that they're part of the team and they feel encouraged to have a conversation. So another question here from sprint planning perspective: what are your favorite tools to facilitate estimation and poker planning? A lot of times, a lot of the teams I work with, we usually end up going through the backlog. We look at the stories, and basically I ask the team, after we review the story, we review the acceptance criteria, we review the sprint goal, we talk about what is it that we're going to do over the next 2 weeks, what are the customer values, the user values that we're going to extract out of these features that we're building over the next 2 weeks. As we go through each story, I ask the team members to basically go through and take a vote against the estimation of that story, and then we collectively as a team will take those values and come to an agreement as to what is the average of that estimation. In terms of tools, there's a lot of tools that are out there that are free. As well as paid. And we'll talk about some of the tools later on in this presentation. Moving on, sprint retrospective. In distributed teams, this becomes even more valuable and more important. The teams could really use this time to talk about how they feel, help them through the isolation, find out what's making it hard for them in the remote environment, so you can help them fix those issues every sprint. Again, when you're co-located, certain teams I've noticed from my experience sometimes end up skipping retrospective, or they may end up doing a retrospective every other sprint, mostly because the teams are working together, they're sitting next to each other, and they're able to have like daily conversations and be able to adjust from the problems that they're finding. But when you're in a distributed team environment, as people are in today's environment, retrospective becomes even more important because team members are isolated. They're working on their own. You have one developer that's writing code in their office. You have someone else doing QA, some QA automation. You have someone else that might be taking care of DevOps. Everyone's in isolation. There is no environment for them to speak. And they might run into problems, whether it's problems with the tools that they're using, the environments that they have, some of the cloud infrastructure, whatever it may be. There's always going to be problems. And this meeting becomes extremely important to talk about some of those problems so that you can define a plan and a path forward to address those problems and make the next sprint even more efficient than the current sprint. I'm going to pause here for a second. I have another question from an attendee. For stand-ups and even other ceremonies, do you make it mandatory for every team member to be on video too? Does it help based on your experience working with other clients? So I'm going to talk about this a little bit further down under communication, but yes, on daily stand-ups, extremely important to make sure that everyone feels connected, and having video probably now today becomes even more than it did yesterday, or not yesterday, but maybe 3 weeks ago before we entered the state of isolation and quarantine. So it's extremely important to have video. It's extremely important so that everyone sees one another. Another part of this question, does it help based on your experience working with other clients? So having that interaction during daily stand-up with not only the team members, but also the stakeholders, and having everyone on video, it definitely helps. It brings people together, and it makes the isolation just a little bit less isolated. And looks like I skipped over another important Scrum event, the sprint review. So in distributed environments, showcasing your work via some sort of a screen share as well as video, this becomes extremely important as well. You don't want to create an impression that people are just working in some sort of vacuum isolation. You really do want to showcase your work, typically in a co-located team environment. You're getting everyone together in a room. You're demoing, you're showcasing your work on a screen. This can also be done from a distributed team perspective by using, whether it's Zoom, GoToMeeting, WebEx, Google Meet, a lot of different tools out there from free to paid, leveraging those to really showcase the work that you've done, showcase the value that you're bringing to the end users, that you've met the sprint goal, that you have successfully completed your sprint backlog, and you've created a potentially shippable product increment that is now ready to be used by whatever the users may be. It's also extremely important, more so in distributed environment, to get your stakeholders involved. I would highly encourage team members that are doing remote sprint reviews to not only involve the team members, but to involve as many stakeholders as possible so that they feel excited and they feel part of the development process, and that they see that the team, while isolated, while distributed, are successfully working together and delivering on a specific goal for that increment. So looking at all these, all the Scrum events, this is a typical schedule that I like to use, and this schedule is valid for the current situation that we're in, the state of isolation, teams working remotely. Couple of tricks and tips over here is that I would avoid starting and stopping a sprint on Monday or Friday for some reason. The guy Murphy always, his laws always kick in on Mondays and Fridays, and sometimes things end up going wrong. So I would highly encourage avoiding starting and stopping a sprint on Monday or Friday. An ideal day or ideal part of the week is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And based on a lot of different sprints that we worked on across many different teams, we found that starting a sprint on Wednesday and stopping it on Tuesday seems to be the most ideal. So what does this mean from a distributed team perspective, right? You got to have your planning, you got to have your daily stand up, you got to have your review, your retrospective, your sprint kickoff, your backlog grooming, definitely a session in there so that various different team members can get together to talk about architecture and UX, so that the team feels that they're all part of one team and they're all working together. So please post any questions that you may have, or if you have any suggestions of tools to help during this stage. So we talked about the structure that allows us to have a framework for Agile. The next important part for distributed teams is communications. Honest and effective communication is a prerequisite for building trust. Distributed teams start to feel like one team and align itself to one common vision when that trust is there. When you have this alignment, this allows the team to enter into a state of productivity. So, what is effective communication? I found this during my research for this webinar. This is from an old research back in, I think, somewhere in the mid to late 80s. But when I started reading about this and started looking into it, I find that this still holds true today, and probably even more important from a distributed environment perspective. This is called the media richness theory, and you can Google this and you can find a lot of great writings about this, and there's a lot of different interpretation of this. And it was originally developed to describe and evaluate communication media within organization. What it does is that it measures sort of warmth of communication from extremely cold and ineffective to hot and effective. So what does all this mean in this curve, right? So if you look at the old ways in traditional waterfall ways of working, a lot of focus was put into doing things via paper, right? Documentation, you're writing your requirements. In terms of communicating this, we see research after research that this is, in terms of the richness of communication, this is extremely cold and not so effective because your market conditions change and you're not able to adapt fast enough to change those requirements. Moving up to email conversations, a little bit better, right? You can have some great conversations via email, whether it's one-on-one or with group, but things still tend to get lost in translation via email. As we move up, the richness starts to get much hotter. The best, as you know, before we entered the state of isolation, was basically face to face, right? Two people or a group of people getting together in a room or around a, around a whiteboard, around a water cooler, and basically just having a conversation about ideas and talking about the things that they need to accomplish, how they're going to extract value, how are they going to reach a goal. This is the most effective way of communication, and it's one of the best way of communication. But given the state that we're in, this becomes extremely difficult. So how do we simulate the same type of environment today? So you could have phone conversation, but the problem with phone conversation, right? A conference call, you can get on a conference call with 5, 6, 10, 15, whatever number of people. The problem with phone conversation is that I don't know if you've noticed, but I've definitely noticed in a lot of conversation that I might be part of, um, where someone is talking, I might be on the side making dinner reservations. My wife might be texting me about picking something up after work, and someone's asking a question. I'm on mute. I hear my name, I change focus, and I unmute and say, sorry, I didn't hear that, right? So phone conversation, while it's effective, it's not as effective as some other forms of communications, such as face-to-face. As we move up the curve, video conversations start to become probably one of the best forms of communication. In today's environment, especially with what we're dealing with, this, I believe, becomes your best friend. It becomes your best friend in distributed teams. We at 3Pillar, a lot of the product development efforts that I work on, essentially I'm on video roughly 6 hours a day, basically working with the various members of our remote team, whether they're in New York or other parts of the US, or whether they're in Romania or they're in India. We're constantly on video. The video's on. We're chatting. We're using tools that simulate whiteboard. We're sketching stuff. We're sketching our ideas. We're having conversations. Video allows for that deeper connectivity, that the eye contact, the facial movement, the gesture, the emotion. It also allows, it also creates an environment so that when people are looked at, they try to appear together and present. Very different than a phone conversation. Faces, as opposed to voice, is deeply important to detect mood. So video becomes extremely important, and it becomes even more important in today's environment. I'm going to pause right here. Looks like I have a stream of questions, so I'm going to go through them. This is, I realized that Agile was developed as a software development tool. What other applications, products, services, etc., can Agile process be used for? I think while Agile was developed for software, I think this can be applied to just about anything you do, whether it's something related to documentation, in your daily life, even if you have kids, if you're doing some sort of activities or planning with your kids, or even planning for vacation. Remember, set of values and principles. It allows you to adapt to changing times, having a structure and framework, and an effective communication. Those are some of the tools that can be used not only for software development, but it can be used for just about anything in your life. Another question came in, any other tips on how to enhance the individual interactions besides or outside the Agile ceremonies? Yes, so the interactions should not be just limited to Agile ceremonies. So we talked about the daily stand-up, right? Where the team is getting together every day for 15 minutes and really checking in. But outside of that, more time has to be spent, especially in remote environment perspective, with your team members, whether it's having that one-on-one conversation with a specific team, like say, for example, you have a set of features that are heavily dependent on that are heavily geared towards a front-end developer, and you're having those conversations with those front-end developers. I would highly encourage doing that, not only at daily stand-up, but if the whole team is not required, outside of daily stand-up, and make sure that whatever outcome that you have from that conversation is shared with all other team members. Whether it's a quick summary via some sort of instant messaging tool that you may use like Slack, or a direct message, or some sort of a team channel that you may have, to kind of make sure that the team is included in those conversations. They understand the topics that you talked about and some of the conclusions that you might have come to. So I would highly encourage not only having conversations within the Scrum ceremonies, but a lot of time has to be spent with your team members outside of those Scrum ceremonies. Sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide. So besides video and having that open and honest conversation and constantly talking to your team and really discussing the items and the features, another effective communication tool is the product backlog. The product backlog items are a placeholder for conversation, right? Each item can lead to many different conversations with the various different teams you have, various different team members you have. Everyone should have the same access to the product backlog. This should be visible. It should be accessible by all team members so that they can clearly see what are all the things that are important to make this product successful, that aligns against the value that you are looking for to reach with your users. It lets team members really engage with work and each other. Having a transparent backlog brings people together. In distributed team environment, don't let your definition of ready slip. It can be very easy because everyone's isolated, everyone's kind of working on their own thing, and it can become very easy to slip on making sure that you have a very clean and effective backlog. The stories in your product backlog really need to be well defined and clear. At the top of your backlog, they should absolutely be very clear. Maybe somewhere towards the bottom, they may not necessarily be 100% clear, but at least the team can look at it and essentially see, okay, here's our entire goal for this product or for this release, or over the next 2 months or 1 month, or whatever that increment might be. So how do we bring all this together? We bring all this together by making sure that we've identified the right tools, and in distributed work environment, this becomes extremely important, right? Having the right tools. There's tons of tools out there. You can Google remote product development tools, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds of entries that lead to various different tools. And every tool has its own advantage, disadvantage, and there's really no one tool that's right for one specific team. I think you really have to look at the tool and look at what the tool is going to allow you to do and work together as a team to say, is this tool going to help us make our life easier and more efficient? And are these tools going to help us collaborate in a remote environment much better? So some of the categories for video conferencing, which I'm sure you've heard on the news and a lot of blog posts, people are raving about Zoom. But beyond Zoom, there's a lot of different ones out there. We at 3Pillar, we have Google Enterprise license for all our global employees. So we specifically stick to using Google Meet when we're having conversations. It allows us to do screen share, turn the video on. There's GoToMeeting, there's Skype for one-on-one, one to few people conversation. There's Microsoft Teams in certain parts of the world, especially in Asia. WhatsApp is a lot more popular than any other video or text messaging tools. FaceTime, if you're specifically on iOS, but there's tons out there. There's free, there's paid. Doesn't matter what it is, I would highly encourage in this environment to pick a tool and make sure that it has video. We talked about transparent backlog, right? So to make an accessible backlog, there's Jira, there's Rally, there's version 1, Pivotal. We at 3Pillar have been using Jira. I've used Rally in the past. I've used Pivotal, but most of my distributed team work career has been in and around Jira. One caution about Jira is when you're having conversations in Jira with a lot of the stories as you're refining your backlog, you're looking at your sprint. Jira has a very powerful commenting tool. I would encourage you not to utilize the commenting tool to have deep conversations, because what ends up happening is that, and I've seen this a lot, you would end up getting hundreds and hundreds of comments, and it becomes extremely difficult to kind of manage those comments and actually go through and try to extract out what are the most important comments against that story. So I would encourage having those conversations outside of Jira so that you can get to a refined understanding and a negotiation amongst the team members on the clarity of that specific story or whatever that you may have within that Jira ticket, and then update the ticket and try to use the comments a little bit less than more. Various different collaborative workspace. Miro is an extremely powerful collaboration workspace that we at 3Pillar started utilizing. This allows us to do a group level sprint release schedule, whiteboarding, road mapping. We use it, our UX people use it for journey mapping. We use it for interaction modeling, sequence diagrams, having just conversations about specific details of a specific feature that we may be working on. We may use parts of it during our user research. So extremely powerful workspace. Miro is not the only one out there. There's many more out there that allows you to have a central place where various different team members can collaborate. Whatever it may be, pick a tool that makes it easy for all your distributed team members to come together in one single unified application, and it becomes easy for them to access. It becomes easy to get in, to look at information, to extract information. Confluence is another one, though Confluence tends to be very document focused. Trello is another powerful one. Google Docs, Microsoft Word. Marvel's extremely powerful for UX interaction. There's InVision, there's Zeppelin. Again, a lot of tools out there. In terms of communication tools, I would highly encourage something like Slack or any of its competitors, having conversations via direct messages. Sure, email conversations are important, but that's probably the last resort. well, second to last. Document-based communication is probably the last resort. If you need to create some sort of specification, doing it in document is great. Sending it out via email and having a quick conversation might be great. But when you're working remotely and having conversations with your team members remotely, again, I would really encourage just those direct conversations. If you can't just get on a video chat, do it via a channel, direct message. I would encourage setting up several groups for each project that you're working on. One at the team level, maybe one group that has all the key team leads in there, maybe one message specifically for UX so that UX level conversations can occur, maybe another channel just for testing or QA perspective so that those conversations can happen. Retrospective for distributed teams is extremely important. So again, there's a lot of tools out there, Padlet, and some of them that I mentioned here. These are extremely powerful tools. Some are free, like Padlet is completely free. Some allow you to do anonymous retro, which personally for me is very important because it encourages, especially in a distributed team environment, and while everyone's on video, it encourages people not to be put on the spot, but it also gives them an avenue for them to state some of the feelings that they have currently or had during the sprint without feeling like they may be singled out because of a specific statement that they made. So I'm going to pause right here for a second, and we have about 7 minutes. Encourage you to ask any questions that you may have, and I'll try to get to them. There was another poll that we had. Rafa, if you can pull up the poll just to kind of.
Sure.
So what are your main concerns working in this new distributed environment? And would love to hear from you and just to get a sense of the pulse of the audience and really understand what are some of the things that they're struggling with.
Okay. Results are on the screen.
Looks like everyone's all of the above. Our productivity will decrease. Looks like probably the heaviest is I won't have a clear understanding of what is being done. The team will lose motivation. So let me address some of these. Rafa, if you can just leave this up for a minute. If you could just leave I don't know if you can bring the results back up.
You wanted the results, yep. Got it.
So probably the most important one is I won't have a clear understanding of what is being done. So again, I encourage having some sort of a central board. There are tools that allow you to do this that provides the status, like Jira provides this, where you can look at the current state of the team, what they're working on, what are some of the tickets, what are the ones that are in flight, what are the ones that are completed, what are the ones that have been tested, what are the ones that have been accepted. I think this gives you a really good idea as to what is actually being done, and a lot of your tools that you may utilize have some of this. And if you don't have access to that tool, or you may not have started working on that tool or bought that tool, then even having some sort of a shared document, whether it's Google Doc or putting it on Dropbox, where the team lead or the product owner is basically updating it and providing the state of affairs for the team. I would also encourage making sure that you're having daily conversations so that everyone has a clear understanding of what they're actually working on. So really follow some of the mechanisms identified in the daily stand-up as one of the Scrum events, and that gives you the pulse of the team for that day. and what are some of the struggles that they have, so that the teams are working on addressing those problems, and utilize some sort of direct communication channels to talk about during the day, with status updates that, hey, the team had this problem, and here's how we resolved it over the next 4 hours, and here's what it's ready for the next day. Um, in terms of team will lose motivation, again, rallying the team around your goal and your vision. If you can, Rafa, if you can go back to the presentation. I'm gonna turn the video back on here. And again, rallying your team around some sort of a board that has your product vision, your goal, the problems you're solving for your users. All of these become a great motivating factor. Some place where they can clearly see progress starts to lead towards motivation that, hey, what I'm doing something in isolation, sitting here at my desk, in my room or in my kitchen or in my basement, wherever it may be, I'm starting to see progress, and I'm starting to see the things that I'm doing from the bottom up, moving all the way up into a release that aligns against the product vision, that maps to some specific goal that's going to make a user's life a little bit easier. So another question here that I'm going to try to address in the next couple minutes. What are some of the common problems, mistakes? What are some of the common problems and or mistakes people make in using Agile in their problem-solving project development? What are some of the common problems? So some of the common problems or mistakes people make in using Agile is that they skip daily stand-up, they skip some of the rituals, which are extremely important, especially in a distributed environment perspective. They don't have a transparent backlog, or the backlog is not updated, which is extremely important in, again, in a distributed environment. If you don't have some of those things, you're going to reach a state where the team is going to start to lose motivation, because they're not having a clear understanding of what are the things, how are they driving towards a unified vision? What is that, what is that light bulb at the end of the tunnel that what is that light at the end of the tunnel that they're trying to get towards? So making sure that that constant communication is there will allow you to get over some of the problems that you may have. And we're running up on 1 minute to go here, so I'm going to wrap up. If there are other questions, please post them, and I'll try to get to them before we end. So I wanted to close out with a final point. As we saw earlier, the final value in Agile Manifesto is basically respond to change over following a plan, right? Hopefully I did that. I had a specific plan, the slides that were there, certain questions came up, and it was extremely important to kind of, create an environment of collaboration, and to be able to stop and take those questions, as opposed to following a very specific plan, but to respond to the changing conditions. So respond to change over plan is an extremely important value within the Agile Manifesto, and Scrum does this extremely well. It allowing teams to work in an unknown world. We don't know what's going to happen next week. We don't know what's going to happen in the next couple months, given the current situation that we're in. I'm in Virginia. We just found out yesterday that the governor has basically issued a mandatory stay-at-home order until June 10th. So, we were originally planning to get back into the office. Even though we work remotely, we do sometimes check into the office sometime middle of September. But now it looks like we're going to be stuck at home until June. So I myself have to be able to respond to this change, as opposed to following a very specific plan that I might have had over the next month. And what that's going to mean for me and with my team and working with my team is that how are we going to continue to work remotely? What additional tools are we all going to research and identify and try to figure out the strengths and weaknesses and see how we can integrate those tools into our daily life? And as well as, what instead of spending 4 hours on video or 6 hours, maybe figure out a way to spend 8 hours a day on video so that we feel less isolated. So I hope with that said, we're 1 minute over. I hope today's session has somewhat helped you to alleviate some of your concerns and challenges of being agile in a distributed team. Again, I'm Kunal Shah, product manager at 3Pillar Global, and thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions or you have further things that you want to ask me, please feel free to email us at communications@3Pillar Global, and I'll be more than happy to respond with those questions via email. And you can find me on LinkedIn under Kunal Shah as well as Twitter. And final thought, with the current state, please keep calm and good luck on your new distributed or current distributed team.
Thanks, Kunal.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.